City organizations still play the race role. Whether you are a white mayor, whether you are a black mayor, whether you are an Indian mayor, whether whatever your ethnicity is, it seems to be that they or people cluster folks per their income and per their race. And it seems to be that anywhere you go, if the land isn't really worth anything, you're probably going to find minorities there, right? So they're basically positioning minorities in places where the land isn't that clean. Not used, vacant, a bunch of grass, high weeds. The space that DHD purchased was a junkyard. So on the right-hand side going down Flint Street, which is why their address is 5 and 15, 15 Flint Street was a junkyard growing up. So all you would see back there is just people, tires and junk and garbage, and that's what that was. I'm involved because I'm upset. Right? I'm involved because I'm upset that the city of Rochester is doing a supposed cleanup program in my neighborhood and undermine the community. So I began DJing early, and because of my DJing and working with people, I've always had to use contracts, right? So you get burnt so many times. And because of dealing with contracts, I ended up making music at an early age, making records, reading contracts from record companies, and that transitioned to why I'm able to understand what's going on now, the Brownfield, because I basically do the same research I would have to do if I was reading a record contract.
Before the 30s, very few people actually owned houses. It was really hard to own a house. Most mortgages were 10 to 15 years. Redlining is a practice used by the federal government from the 30s to the late 60s, where literal maps of every city had red shaded areas, red lined areas shaded in, that were areas deemed where African Americans could live. And the way this was enforced through these maps is if you were a black person, you could only live in a redlined area and you couldn't get a mortgage. Whereas if you were a white person, you were restricted to blue and green areas, nicer parts of the city away from factories, away from pollution, by better means of transportation. In the Plex neighborhood, it was already kind of an area where immigrants were living back in the 1800s. The homes weren't as nice necessarily in that neighborhood. More of the homes were rental properties. So in the 70s, when the Everests came in to start their vacuum oil company, they wanted it by the river and by the canal, and they wanted to put it in a neighborhood where people wouldn't get too upset. So they went into this neighborhood where people didn't necessarily own all of their homes. People protesting that lived in these areas, like the toxic fumes and awful smells and black clouds of smoke pouring out of the vacuum oil refinery, and that led to that neighborhood not being as nice of a place, and who was allowed to live there, or where rental properties or cheap rental properties were in a neighborhood like Plex.
A lot of times, communities don't really know the level of contamination. They really haven't been checked out by the government. That no one's really cared enough or really done studies. So the public knows that they're contaminated, but they don't know with what. They don't know how long they've been contaminated. So that worry is a lot of stress on those communities. Basically, the flooding, which we're getting in this area, according to the National Climate Assessment, is 71% increase in heavy flooding. That means at periods when we do have rainfall are incredibly heavy. So this is flooding. And when you're hitting contaminated area, brownfield areas, all the toxins, the PCBs, man-made chemicals, dangerous toxins that are in these sites have a tendency to flow out of them into the streets, down the drain pipes, into our lakes and our rivers and our streams.
So for me, it seems like it's always money over lives, right? So our thing is we want to save lives over money, right? That's the whole slogan we were trying to kind of get out there, lives over money, right? It's amazing to me that DHD, a developer, would submit the lowest level cleanup, right? If I was a developer and I wanted to make sure that the people who lived in my development lives were safe, I wouldn't do the minimum. Are you willing to take the liability of 10 years from now, someone, kid or daughter, getting cancer because you didn't take the right steps? So what I would say to the developer is, would you let your daughter live there? Would you let your son live there? Are you willing to take the risk